Before I start, I'd like to thank Nintendo for sending us a copy to review. It's been 19 years. Metroid Fusion might have been the first 2D Metroid game I ever played, and it is still one of my favourites in the franchise. It had great gameplay, an engaging story, and a wonderful sense of making the player feel both powerful and helpless. It was a fantastic experience, and put me in the mood for more Metroid, which I got by going back and playing previous games in the series, as well as the Prime line of games, and then eventually playing Metroid Zero Mission when it came to the Wii U Virtual Console. None of these titles, however, followed on from where Fusion left the series, and so that elusive Metroid 5 remained nothing but a desire for almost 2 decades. But Nintendo finally delivered this year with Metroid Dread on Nintendo Switch, developed by Mercury Steam, who developed 2017's Samus Returns on Nintendo 3DS. So, did Dread deliver as the long-awaited sequel to one of my favourite games in the series, or has it left me with dread for this franchise's future? Let's find out. Metroid Dread had a lot of hard work ahead of it, both as an anticipated sequel, but also as a symbol for the future of the franchise. 2017 Samus Returns was a good game, but as a 2D Metroid game, it was undoubtedly the weakest. Except for maybe the NES title from 1986, but that's really an issue of age and hardware limitations dragging it down. The 3DS title felt a bit clunky, with its new counter mechanic greatly getting in the way of the game's momentum and making it feel slower than previous entries. It also shoehorned in various new story details and boss battles to change up the formula of the game it was remaking. While this was a good idea on paper, some of these new additions, especially the ones made to the end of the game, actively brought down the whole experience for some players and made it worse than the original Game Boy game. I mention all of this because I'm very thrilled to report that the team over at Mercury Steam clearly took the feedback from players to heart, as Metroid Dread improves on everything and then some. The gameplay now feels incredibly smooth and exciting. The simple addition of new movement options like the slide and flash shift, as well as the return of the shine spark, allows Samus to traverse her environment much faster and in fun new ways. Then simply giving players the ability to dash counter, ensuring Samus doesn't stop in place when trying to parry an opponent, vastly improves that mechanic and makes it a much more viable option during combat, especially against bosses. The way Samus controls in general is great. Sometimes it can feel like I need an extra hand to pull off some of the more advanced shots in the game, with all the buttons I have to be simultaneously pressing, but for the majority of the time it feels like the player really is in full control of the bounty hunter, with even the slightest of movements replicated, which is a must for trying to sequence break or just reach those difficult upgrades hidden throughout the world. Full control is also required in the game's stealth sections, probably the biggest new addition to the game, so much so that the monster Samus hides from, Emmy, is all over the promotional material and box for the game. The stealth sections feel like a natural follow-up to the SAX from Fusion. In that game, the SAX would show up in scripted sections and hunt Samus down. It was a real threat and all the player could do was run away. The Emmy follows on the same principle, but the encounters are no longer scripted. Now the player is required to take the initiative on when and where to hide to avoid a capture, staying silent and using the new Phantom Cloak ability to remain undetected, at the cost of Aeon energy and eventually health if it's used for too long. These sections can get very tense, or very chaotic if the Emmy finds Samus and begins its pursuit. The player really doesn't want this to happen as the Emmy can one-shot Samus, causing a game over. Trust me, you will be seeing that screen a lot in this game. It's possibly the hardest Metroid game to date, but also it can be the most forgiving with checkpoints before bosses and the Emmy encounter areas, so the player isn't sent too far back when they inevitably die. One light criticism of the Emmy are the fact that they are restricted to specific areas. While it offers the players a means of escape, and I totally understand from a game design perspective why this had to happen, knowing this fact makes the Emmy less of a concern for a lot of the game. In Fusion, the SAX really only appeared in scripted sections, but first-time players didn't know this, so there is always a sense of tension that at any minute the SAX could appear and begin hunting the player down, like Mr. X or Nemesis from the Resident Evil series. This feeling isn't here with the ME, although it is understandable why. This is, however, probably better for the level design as a whole. Not only are the ME sections well designed to give Samus places to hide but also escape and, when the time comes, fight back, but the rest of the world is very well put together. The game does a good job of funneling the player in the right direction, but also offers enough exploration to make it feel like the player's choice, and if they are skilled enough, allows them to sequence break to get certain items early, or skip certain areas entirely. The fact that the world can do this so naturally with only one or two minor moments where the way to progress isn't very clear is a testament to the strength of the game designers. Overall, the gameplay is rock solid. The world is fun to navigate, Samus is fun to control, and the stealth sections are great at building tension and genuinely making the player fearful. When you add on the high difficulty but light punishment, the game becomes a fun challenge that fans of 2D action games will enjoy. I have no issue saying that, from a gameplay perspective, Metroid Dread might be the best in the series. Presentation wise, it is also no slouch. The game looks fantastic, especially on the new Switch OLED. The design of Samus, the ME, and the Chozo warriors, especially Big Bad Ravenbeak, are ace, and this is probably a good point to bring up the excellent art book that came with the special edition. You get to see some of those early concept designs for Samus and the ME, and it is super fascinating. I do think Mercury Steam has some issues with its original monster design. There are a handful of bosses and creatures that look identical, just maybe with more eyes or slightly crinklier skin, and it can start to feel samey, but this is kind of a nitpick. Less of a nitpick and more of an issue are the loading times. Making the game this good looking on the Switch is certainly an achievement, with the drawback of transitioning from area to area being a bit of a chore. Whether it's elevators or teleports, sometimes players can be waiting for almost a minute to be warped into a new area. Not ideal for a game so heavy on backtracking for 100% completion. However, one way the game excels is its cinematics, especially the interactive ones in fight scenes. It's reminiscent of Other M, but in a good way. One of the best parts of that game was how agile Samus was and how that allowed the boss battles to seem more epic. Metroid Dread takes this approach to bosses and runs with it, having some of the coolest boss battles in the series' history. What makes it better is that it's all still in gameplay. While Samus may be running and jumping on her own, the player is deciding what attacks she is using and how frequently she is using them. In practice, this just means spamming the missile button until the cutscene ends, but it's the thought that counts. These scenes also just let Samus be cool. Samus is probably at her best here. The way she is portrayed in cutscenes as an absolute beast, almost always in control over the situation and able to strike devastating blows on her opponents, is exactly what I've wanted to see from her. It's the way Samus felt in previous games, but the technology wasn't there to achieve it. Other M could have had this, and almost did from a gameplay perspective, but the story segments of that game ran counter to how the player felt, and made Samus feel inconsistent. Metroid Dread is how it should be done. And that brings us to the story. I've been very positive for this game so far, but this is where my critiques are really going to come into full swing. I'm going to try and be general here and not actually mention any specific plot points that happen, but if you want to avoid all spoilers, then here is my final verdict of the game. Metroid Dread is easily one of the best Metroid games, and honestly a must-play for fans of action, platformers, and of course, Metroidvanias. It could easily be Game of the Year, and even though this title is meant to be the final chapter in the story of Samus and the Metroids, I don't think you really need to have played any previous game to enjoy it and understand what's happening. In fact, it might be better if you don't. For those of you who are still around, let's briefly touch upon the story and how I felt like this follow-up to Metroid Fusion, this long-awaited sequel, is actually not that at all. Like I said before, I'm going to avoid specific story spoilers, but what I will mention is the lack of any real follow-up to Metroid Fusion in this game. One of the things that really made a sequel to Metroid Fusion exciting is how that game ended. Samus and Adam had uncovered a secret plot by some shady sect of the Galactic Federation and ruined all of their plans, technically for the second time as they did this exact same thing in Other M. What's more, the Metroids were officially all gone except for Samus, who is now the last Metroid in the galaxy. The X-Parasites are also gone, finally wiped out for good through the destruction of their home planet by Samus. It shook up the status quo, and is why every Metroid game to launch since had to be a prequel or remake. In Metroid Dread, however, only one of those plot points is even addressed, the Samus having Metroid DNA part, and that's really because it's unavoidable. Everything else is completely ignored or undone, such as the X still being around. The game even purposefully skates around the Galactic Federation's plot, leaving it ambiguous if there were any real consequences to Samus and Adam's actions in the last 2 games. Considering that 2 games were spent building this secret Federation organisation up to be the big villain Samus must face, and in fact Other M was specifically made to help build up to the story of Metroid 5, and then just completely ignored in Dread, save for an image in the gallery mode, their absence here means that that dangling plot thread, arguably the most enticing one, is still left dangling. Instead, Metroid Dread chooses to follow up on the Chozo plotline, something that was only really added in 2017's Metroid Samus Returns. Before that, the Chozo plot was seemingly finished, but then was suddenly brought back and pushed into the focus, over the plot that fans had been actually waiting for. And it does sting, especially when the role of the Chozo played here could have easily been handled by this sect with barely any differences. It doesn't really tie into the overall series narrative that this game was supposed to be concluding. I get that Mercury Steam set up a story all their own in the 3DS remake, and so naturally wanted to follow it up here. I can't fault them for wanting that, and in a vacuum, this is a good story, at least by Metroid standards. I do have some gripes with some specific moments that I won't spoil here, but overall, it's good. It's just not the promised end of a saga that fans have been waiting 19 years for. It's just another step in that narrative, and who knows how long we'll have to wait until we get the real conclusion we've been waiting for. Hopefully not very long though. This game is fantastic and I highly recommend everyone picks it up. Between this and Prime 4, we could be in for another Metroid renaissance, and if so, a Metroid 6 will certainly be on the way, one that hopefully does follow up those other plot points that fans have been wanting to see answered for almost 20 years now. Let's not make it another 20 more. Alright guys, I want to thank Nintendo again for sending us a copy of this game to review. Obviously I enjoyed it and I hope it does them well. Thank you for everyone watching. Let me know your thoughts. If you stayed and listened to all the story stuff, let me know your thoughts on that specifically, because I feel like I'm probably in the minority about this, but for some reason the Metroid story I'm quite passionate about, and so this was like a real thing for me. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Special thanks to all of our patrons on screen right now. They're all super lovely, and you can also be super lovely if you want to join them, but equally sharing, liking, leaving comments, subscribing if you're not, you know, all of that jazz will put you in a good spot in my heart, I'll tell you that. So thank you all for listening and watching, and always remember to return to the source.